Welcome, everybody, to This is Crucial. I'm here with my co-host, Charlene Han Powell. She'll be introducing our guest tonight. Bless you all for showing up to share in some of our real talk and sacred exploration about healing justice and racial equity. These conversations are not about presenting expert commentary. We don't have any grand theories to teach you tonight, but these conversations are about sharing our lived experience and our questions and even our hesitation when we talk to each other about justice and also about race. Charlene, would you introduce our guest, please?
I'd be happy to. So one of the values that we hold in this space is that proximity matters. And this has become a part of the conversation in terms of how we exist in community, who our neighbors are, and also the narratives that are close to our heart. The proximity of my experience as an Asian American woman, as somebody who's living in Oakland, who serves a church in Berkeley, in California, proximity matters. It mattered when I was in New York City, when COVID hit that area hard and fast back in the spring, back in March of 2020. For Amos, proximity mattered when he was squarely located in Dallas in the midst of the blackout this past winter. And for the past year, for Sarah, who serves as a pastor, as a clergy person in Minneapolis, in St. Paul, near Minneapolis, proximity has been a very real an important part of her reality, her existence as a human being and as a pastor. And so I have known Sarah for years, pre even being a called pastor, and she has always been a voice of honest wisdom and truth and vulnerability in my life. I text with her on the regular. She is someone who is a safe place for me to come with my fears and my rage. And so she started a new call this past January. So that's something that I am familiar with as well. She is the lead pastor at St. Paul's UCC Church in St. Paul, Minneapolis. And so, Sarah, we are so honored and glad to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Charlene. Yeah, at the church that I serve is in St. Paul, but I do live right across the river in Minneapolis, and within walking distance of 38th in Chicago, where George Floyd was murdered. And it feels right and sacred to be able to say that he was murdered, and we now can say that officially. So thanks for having me here. I appreciate it. And for the record, I did try to convince Amos and Charlene that they could find somebody better than me, but I am here as the mediocre white lady in your midst, ready to go. So I'm just trying to be self-deprecating,
Well, and that honestly set up this conversation to be that much more rich and honest. Sarah had a very surprising reaction for Amos and I in saying, she was like, "Are you sure you want me as your guest? I can introduce you to a Black community leader or clergy person, someone else who is more positioned to be speaking about this from their area of expertise, from their lived experience." And yet on this conversation, we have a Black man, an Asian woman, and a white woman. And that is the church, is us from our various vantage points having to do this important work. And so your perspective matters, and it's important to us. So we're glad that you're here. Amos?
Sarah, we're glad you're here. Tell us about what it's been like leading a church this past week.
Well, this past week and really through the past year, not only in pandemic, but in the wake of George Floyd's murder, so close to my previous congregation, which was Westminster in downtown Minneapolis, my home in South Minneapolis, and the church in St. Paul, which is very much a church in the city. It's been tense in the city. It's been hard to know how to lead in two predominantly white congregations without seeming performative. it's been a year of learning and unlearning what I thought I knew. I was doing all the anti-racist, racial justice work that I was supposed to do a year ago. But I would say this year has been a real reckoning with all that I didn't know and continue to not know, particularly about the city of Minneapolis, particularly about the police department in Minneapolis, and about how we deal with race in our liberal, progressive, quote unquote, progressive city. This year has affected my children's lives. My daughter goes to Minneapolis Public School, and just last week she went to distance learning for the latter half of the week because we thought there was going to be major unrest in the city. And there already was because of Dante Wright's killing in Brooklyn Center, which is adjacent to North Minneapolis. So not far from where we live either. There was this thing called Operation Safety Net that the police and the state government had put into place, where National Guard troops were occupying our neighborhood. We had Humvees down the street from us. And last summer, the whole city, like we woke up in the morning and it smelled like burning in our city. And they were telling us to douse our house with our hoses so that they would burn slower in the event that happened. So yeah, it was real. But I come at it from the perspective of a white person who does in fact happen to be clergy. And so I'm in a position of leadership, but feeling wholly unprepared to be in a leadership position where I needed to be having difficult conversations with community leaders and people at my churches. I needed to be able to lead them and teach them, and feeling like an imposter in some of those conversations, and then having to stick with it even after being corrected, and feeling my defensiveness rise up and feeling ashamed, and all those things that are not productive when it comes to racial justice work. So yeah, it's been a really hard year, and a good year for my growth personally. But the fact remains that George Floyd is dead, and his daughter is without a father, and what a lot of people have described as justice for him is not, in fact, justice. It's just another moment of reckoning with a tradition in the Minneapolis Police Department where the brutality and use of force is endemic. And we just didn't want to know about it.
Yeah.
So
you talked about the Humvees, just what it's like outside your front door. And I mean, I think the news only captures snapshots and definitely probably the most interesting images. And yet there's a feeling, a boots on the ground emotion or energy that you're experiencing. I mean, so it's now called George Floyd Square, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So what's that space like, walking into that space? What is it? How has it been this past year, the past few months, past week?
Yeah. So 38th in Chicago is just, like I said, it's within walking distance of my house. It's in an area of Minneapolis that one of my best friends lives just a block and a half from there. And there's a restaurant right on 38th that we go to all the time, just a block from the intersection. So I think perhaps people have in their minds that this is like a really crime-ridden area. It's just a neighborhood in Minneapolis where people of color happen to live. So I just want to like get rid of that perception of the neighborhood. It's an amazing community in that neighborhood. There's a video on, if you follow 38th in Chicago on Instagram, there's a video of all the business owners in that intersection who have come together to support each other to keep their businesses going. And so one of the calls to action for, if you come to George Floyd Square, to 38th in Chicago, is that you patron one of the businesses at that intersection. So the community has, I want to sort of like, Minneapolis is a great city, and there are communities within the city that are really beautiful neighborhoods and places with people who are doing just wonderful work, who are building businesses and supporting each other. So, but yeah, 38th in Chicago was where George Floyd was murdered. And it has turned into this occupied by Black people in the city of Minneapolis who are organized. There are different groups of people who are organized before that have created space there with artists and clergy and community leaders. A great artist to follow on Instagram is Creatives After Curfew. It's this group of artists that are going around the Twin Cities painting murals on all the boarded up windows.
Wow.
And they're just creating beauty out of destruction. And they're awesome. You should go follow them. But it's so 38th in Chicago, the intersection has become a no-go zone. So that means that police do not go through with cars or officers themselves, I believe. They don't go through that intersection. It's barricaded with cement barricades that have been placed there by groups of people who may, all different kinds of groups of people. I'm sure Black Lives Matter has been a part of the organizing, but also groups that are probably formerly known as gangs in the area, but I don't like that term. And one of the organizers of George Floyd Square, the communications person, they have a communications person at George Floyd Square. Her name's Marsha Howard. You should follow her on Instagram too. She's actually a teacher at the high school that's a few blocks from my house. She's the student, the teenager who actually filmed George Floyd being murdered, and put it on social media, goes to that high school 3 blocks from my house. And this teacher there, Marsha Howard, has taken a year off of school to help run the square. And there's just these amazing people that are occupying that space so that traffic does not go through unless they allow you to go through. But the one of the first protests after George Floyd was murdered went from the west side of Minneapolis across the highway, and it ended up at George Floyd Square. And so when we got there, one of the key things that became apparent was that white people were immediately told by volunteers to go to the periphery. And so that this has turned into sacred space and a space for healing and organizing and teaching. And so from that moment, I very much knew that my place in this whole last year has been to stand more at the periphery and to bear witness to what's happening, and mostly to keep my mouth shut unless I'm preaching or teaching something, but to just watch and listen and stay engaged. So
You're a preacher then, right? So your work this year has been to watch and listen, stay engaged, and be on the periphery. But then again, you've got this task where you've got to proclaim something, you've got to say something um, each week and interpret God's word for God's people. How do you work that tension out? And what are you bringing to your preaching each week that you are drawing from your lived experience in places like George Floyd Square or around some of those tables that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I want to first say that I don't think I've done it well every time. And I was saying to Charlene before this conversation tonight that I've definitely been corrected by people of color, sometimes in a very kind, generous way, and sometimes in a public way. And part of my fragility as a white person is to feel ashamed in those moments, but I'm not being shamed. And I think that's an important distinction, that I'm being held accountable, and that's not shaming. The feeling of shame that I have is my own. And I think white people tend to avoid continuing to engage and preach about racism because we get corrected by people of color, or we get lambasted by maybe some more of our conservative parishioners. And so that feeling of shame among white clergy, I think runs deep, and it has a lot to do with people pleasing and wanting everybody to like us and all that kind of stuff.
Is that a conversation that like you have with other clergy?
I don't know if it's a conversation that I've had openly, but I think I can tell.
Yeah.
I think I can sense that a lot of us feel that way. Maybe I'm overstepping. I should only speak for myself, maybe, but my sense is that there's a lot of unwillingness to stick with difficult topics in our preaching.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to alienate anyone. But we're probably alienating a whole bunch of people by not talking about it. Right. So I just wanted to say, I have been corrected, but how does it inform my preaching going forward? It is a constant learning and unlearning and trying to see the gospel in a way that interrogates my own sense of who I am and who I have been as a Christian. And I was saying to you guys earlier, this fall, I got an email from somebody who had been live streaming my preaching for a while. And she said, you've seemed sad lately. And I thought, I am sad. I'm sad for what I didn't know. I'm sad for what I know now. And I'm sad for all the people who I've hurt. And I'm sad for all the people who continue to have to live with hurt and trauma and feeling less than human by people like me. And so, yeah, I'm like flippin' sad. And I know she was coming from a good place, so it's not about her question, but it was a chance for me to reflect on the idea of preaching during a pandemic and during a national racial reckoning. And I would just like to say too, I've really tried to combat the feeling of, okay, I can be sad, but I can't be exhausted, because that's not allowed. That's I can't be exhausted with racism. as a white preacher. And I think there are other words for it, probably like, well, I was telling you guys last week that a friend of mine, Brennan Blue, who's a clergy person here in the Twin Cities, recently put it as racial stress resilience, and how we need to do this more in our congregations. And I think it's true for ourselves too, as white clergy. But whenever we talk about racial issues in our churches, and someone inevitably isn't going to be happy about it, or multiple people aren't going to be happy about it, instead of disengaging and stepping out of that conversation, either because we feel shame about it or because, we don't want to alienate anyone, the idea is to lean into that racial stress resilience, to build resilience, so that every time we talk about it, we're bringing people along with us. I think for white clergy too, like, this is just part of accompanying your people. Like you're sort of nudging or cultivating a congregation that can deal with sadness and heavy but important and crucial issues for the sake of the gospel.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, yes, amen. Amen to all of that. I'm realizing as you're talking and you're saying these things that are resonating deep within me, and I feel encouraged by that, it does still sound so foreign. I mean, when you said, "Are you sure you want me to be your conversation partner?" Again, it was surprising, mainly because as clergy people, whenever someone hands a clergy person a microphone, they're like, "Oh, sweet, we know what to do with this. Let me take it and preach," right? And so for you to say, "Wait, am I the right person?" And then to talk about, I mean, just even the image. And Amos, I want to hear about what you feel about this idea that you would be able to walk into George Floyd Square, walk straight up to the front, whereas Sarah would be held on the periphery. Like, that is a complete reversal of the systems that we've become accustomed to, right? And so, Sarah, for you to say that, it's so interesting to be okay with standing on the periphery, to actually not even be okay, but to feel called to that place, and to even take ownership of this racism as a white woman. Now, there are so many people who are like, "But I'm white, but I'm not racist. So this is not my sin to own, or this is not my problem to inherit or take ownership of." And yet I hear you very much easily taking this on and saying, "Yeah, no, like I'm a part of this." Like, where does that come from? Like, how is that a part of your learning and unlearning?
well, I should say, I know I keep saying this, but it's not like I have always. I mean, I'm a preacher, like, and I like preaching, and I do like to have the mic. So don't get me wrong. But I also know is maybe the wrong word, but there, I think the more and more you allow yourself to be called out by your own just inherent racial bias and your own inherent racism, if you're willing to, like, you as pastors, you probably know the term self-differentiation from your CPE days or something, but it's this idea of like maintaining sort of like a strong emotional core, so that as conflict or tough words or whatever is coming at you, like, you allow it to come at you and like osmosis kind of like wash over you, and you kind of maintain this you maintain yourself, to be able to continue to be emotionally available. And I think that's what pastors are called to as well, not just to be the voice that occupies the pulpit on Sundays, but to be constantly letting the words of others and the experiences of others wash over us and through us, particularly the gospel in new ways. And I don't know, standing at the periphery is just one way to do that. But I think continuing to be engaged. I mean, I'm engaged in this organization now in St. Paul with, because my new church is a partner with them. And I was telling you guys last week that I was in a Zoom room with a bunch of other clergy from St. Paul. And I had just had a conversation with a Minnesota senator, and she was talking about how Minnesota Congress feels really soulless right now. And I said, she really seemed tired. And one of the people of color on the Zoom really, he gave a sermon. He was like, Jesus didn't get exhausted when he was carrying the cross on his own back. And it went on and on for 5 minutes or so, all because of my comment. And so this is in public. And I don't know, I was saying to you guys that maybe a year ago, I wouldn't have known what to do with myself in that situation. But I'm a leader. I'm called to continuing to show up, even when it's deeply, deeply uncomfortable. It's just, I can't not.
Yeah.
It's like one of the jury members that they were interviewing for the Chauvin trial said, I can't unsee that video. And one of the problems with that is that now that we've all seen the video, we realize all the times we haven't seen. But now that we have seen it, it's like, I can't unsee it. And what does that mean going forward?
Right. Yeah.
I want to remind everybody that we do have some options for you to participate and share in our conversation. You can post questions in YouTube or in Facebook, and those questions will get to us. And as the opportunity comes up during our conversation, we'll try to address as many of those questions as you all have for us tonight. So I want to just offer that reminder. Returning to what you said, Charlene, about the standing at the periphery, I think you invited me to share from my own perspective what that sounded like hearing that. And I've been listening and also thinking at the same time since Sarah told us about that a few days ago. For me, the idea of people being pushed to the periphery at George Floyd Square, I'm going to try not to find meaning in that as a metaphor for other things. I think it's okay for that to just be a description of what's happening at George Floyd Square right now, and not to draw out some other meaning about it for us everywhere else in the country or the world, And again, going back to your introduction, Charlene, like proximity does matter and context does matter. And all these conversations that we're having are just, they're nuanced. I mean, like our facial expressions matter in the moment. They communicate something. The way that we stand as we're talking to someone else, that says something. Our stories that we're bringing to these conversations, they mean something. I don't know about y'all, but it just seems like we don't have enough time to unpack all of that, or enough, right, to make progress with each other, or to get traction, or just find a foothold.
And so what's the result of that?
I don't know. I think the result of it is what we're all experiencing, which is like a tenet. We know how nuanced these conversations are, and how much emotional, how much emotion and feeling we're bringing to them, and how afraid we are.
Yeah.
That they might break down at any moment, right? So I think the result of it is hesitation.
Yeah.
And I mean, Sarah, I mean, I'm grateful for your willingness to like say out loud how hesitant you become. But I don't think it's just white clergy or white people that are hesitant in these conversations. I know I am tentative and hesitant, and not just with other white people, and with my own brothers, with my family, with Black friends that I have.
So Amos, what was your reaction to the announcement of the verdict of the Derek Chauvin trial?
I watched it on my iPad, like actually right outside this little room that I'm in my office. And I was with a couple colleagues of mine and one church member. We were into some other business at the time. We're scrambling, trying to get it on the iPad, for it to pop up. And I do remember as we were scrambling with the iPad, thinking through like what kind of, like I was almost plotting or planning my reaction because there were people in the room. So I wanted to like nail it. I thought about that for a second. Huh?
All eyes on you. Yep.
Right. I was just like, I'm the only Black person in here, so I want to just get this right, no matter what happens. And then I also remember acknowledging how that wasn't possible, and it wasn't true, and it wouldn't be true, and it wouldn't be honest. I was just like, and then I was ashamed for actually having that thought, right? that I should nail my reaction in front of other white people, because I wanted to just make sure I got it right. So I was ashamed about that. And then the verdict was read, and I got up. That was it. I was prepared for to hear not guilty, or like a hung jury or mistrial. Very prepared for that. I wasn't prepared to feel mildly ambivalent in the moment.
Yeah.
Like I wanted to feel something stronger than I did.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, what's wrong with me? How come I don't feel stronger about this? How come it's not eliciting a more like sharp emotion than just that happened?
Yeah. Ambivalence.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the pressure to have the right response is also something that we've discussed as clergy. There is this pressure, and it's a part of the way in which we communicate in the world right now, whether it's through social media. Like everything is a pulpit. Everyone has a mic, actually, right? There aren't limitations to who can push their voice and opinions out anymore. And right now in this space, it's very much about, for the church, responding quickly and effectively and completely. And there is almost this performative pressure, if you will, upon institutions like the church, which is good because in some ways it is calling the church to the carpet and saying, you've been silent. We have been silent about this for far too long. And also, how do we just continue to stay on top of this? And so I guess my question is for all of us, and then I do want to get to some of the questions that are coming in through the chat. What is the role of the church in this moment? Because I do think performative, perfectionism, these things, that is, I mean, and I've seen this called out, these are vestiges of white supremacy, of this excellence, and how church is built on models of success when that wasn't, we're all talking about acts in our various churches, right? And that wasn't in the blueprint of the church from day one, right? Was success built upon and built from human hands. So in this moment, what is the role of the church? How should we be, I mean, I guess even how should we be responding feels like a leading question.
Well, and to Amos's story about feeling ashamed for wanting to nail his answer, I am so sorry that you have to feel that way, because you're right, Charlene, it is white supremacy that we as white people, as we are going through these moments of reckoning and learning, right? We like look to people of color to teach us about the racism that we do to them. And it's just so problematic. It's trauma
Mm.
that we inflict. And, you know, and yet the people of color who are in positions of leadership, who do feel comfortable taking on the role of preaching and teaching in bold ways, I'm so grateful for, and don't want to take away the experience of them having a voice too, right? It's complicated. Every person's experience is different. Being a person of color isn't a monolith, right? Like,
Being
yeah,
white isn't a monolith either. We should
Right.
say that,
Right.
yeah.
Sarah, thanks. Yeah, we're all trying to figure out how to act and be internally and externally.
I actually think that's at least for me, that's hopeful.
Yeah. The discomfort for all of us, there is something hopeful in that. Like the
Mhm.
agitation, the relational agitation that we all sort of feel right now, like yeah.
We're being forced to develop new muscles, muscles not only that are weak because of atrophy of being socially distanced, but also complacency, because the world that we were thrust into back in March wasn't, yes, it was starting to be very mindful of the voices that weren't at the table. But the world that we're in now is hyper aware of those things. So I was actually talking about this with some members today at a virtual table. And we were talking obviously about how much we miss being together in person, but how this Zoom moment has become quite sacred, in that people who have previously felt unsafe walking into a church, and at least in the Presbyterian church, predominantly white spaces. So if I were brand new walking into First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley, I would sit in the back pew. I would scan the room to see if there's anyone who looked like me, right? And I would have to gauge whether or not I feel safe. And yet on Zoom, it's neutral territory. We all gather in these spaces in somewhat of a democratic way, um, and I hope that that informs how we come back as a church, right? How aware are we to the implicit ways we are perpetuating racial divide, racial inequality, racial discomfort, racial racism? I mean, and the list goes on and on. And so, whether it's, even if we're not saying, oh, Black people are not allowed in our church, are our churches safe for Black people? And have we really asked ourselves those questions about what is making this space unsafe? I mean, I remember hearing a clergy person say that for the unchurched, do you know what's unsafe? A hymnal. That assumes that people know how to read sheet music, are familiar with these tunes and this kind of way of singing and being in music. And so automatically, if you're unchurched, you walk into a church, someone says, okay, now stand, open that red book and go to page whatever. You feel like I have no idea what's happening right now. This place is not concerned about what I'm aware of or what I know. So much for the church to be learning. All right, so Randy Brown has put a question to us. I began to read about systemic racism starting with the color of law. I was sad, but angry too. I had been enlisted in falsehood. So what do you think about a white person being angry about racism? It's a fabulous question. Thank you. Sarah?
I don't know. I have multiple feelings about this question. I think anger is a secondary emotion. Well, I should take that back. Anger is, you mentioned rage earlier, Charlene. I mean, there are definitely instances where rage is appropriate. And I think too, we've really lost it. The white church has lost a tradition of lament that I think would give some spiritual undergirding to our anger. But on the other hand, I do think anger can be a secondary emotion. And often I think what it relates to in white people is guilt or shame. And I don't think that those feelings are necessarily productive when it comes to racial injustice and engaging in racial conversations. There's nothing that benefits people of color from our anger or rage. Yes to our lament, yes to leveraging our power for policy change and but emotions that are connected to feelings of us feeling small or that threaten our ego or something like that, I don't think are productive usually.
Amos, there's a question for you specifically. Amos, what would you say if you were front and center in George Floyd Square today?
I mean, sounds like I am avoiding the question, but so be it. I wouldn't say anything at all.
Can you say more to that though? Why? Why is the act of actually not saying something a statement? And I think that for us as preachers who constantly feel the pressure to show up on Sunday with something to say, what is the value, the sacred importance of actually knowing when to hold space?
Yeah, I mean, there's these Sundays where, sometimes I'll sit down to prepare, well, not on Sunday, the week prior to the Sunday, I'll sit down to prepare to preach. And then I'll come across the text will just it'll be so correct that I feel as if my words on top of whatever the proclamation is for that day is just a little redundant at best, and probably inadequate at worst. I think we're accustomed to adding our words where words aren't sometimes necessary. And so what else is there to say? It's a metaphor, it's a symbol. To me, I think it is a being in that place would be participating in a sacrament. When you eat, when the bread is broken and it's given to you, I mean, you can say the body of Christ broken for you, but typically nobody responds. You don't say thank you, you just eat it silently.
So as a Black man, what is the symbol of George Floyd Square to you?
There's a lot of George Floyd squares. So
Hmm.
if I stop to say something in each George Floyd square that I know of,
Hmm.
I wouldn't have time to do much else during the day.
Yeah.
And they're everywhere.
Yep.
Can I respond to Jess's
Yes.
question? Because I think it's related to this.
Can you read it?
Yep. In 2019, under 20 unarmed Black people were killed by the police, and 7,500 Black people were killed mostly by other Black people. How is focusing on the police helping save Black lives? And I don't know where that statistic is from. Doesn't sound quite right, but I think the more I've learned about policing, and this is coming from my experience, I lived in St. Louis for 4 years when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, and now I've lived in Minneapolis during George Floyd's murder, and so I've made myself learn a little bit more about the Minneapolis Police Department. And so for one, police departments can often be insidious and have a really complex structure for covering up criminal activity within the police department. There's a history of sodomization in the Minneapolis Police Department against Black men. And they all act together to cover up these crimes, and they work with the prosecutors. So in the case of Derek Chauvin, it is a really complex situation for the prosecutor to be bringing in witnesses against a police officer, because typically police officers and prosecutors work in tandem, right? They work together. Now, Keith Ellison, who was in the United States Congress, and he's now the Minnesota Attorney General, an African-American man, has been talking about these issues for decades about the police department. And when Amy Klobuchar was running for president this last year, her last political rally in Minnesota was taken over by a Black Lives Matter rally, because when she was Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, she let all these police officers off. She didn't look into the cases. And so these issues have been going on in at least the Minneapolis Police Department for decades. Now, that's just one point I want to say. A second point I want to say is that the history of policing in general goes back to the history of slavery. And so, in these neighborhoods, this was true in St. Louis, and it's true in Minneapolis. A lot of these police officers, I think it's almost 90%, I think, of Minneapolis police officers don't live in Minneapolis. So they come into these neighborhoods that they don't know. And beyond that, I'm getting off track, but a third of African-American men in this country are incarcerated, and that is because of policing and the history of policing dating back to slavery. And so I think when you have a third of African-American men incarcerated at some point in their lives in this nation, this is what we call systemic racism, right? It creates systems of poverty, lack of education, and what ends up happening is that within certain populations, there is more crime because there's lack of resources. And so I just want to say loud and clear that yes, policing plays a huge role in the way we understand racism in this country. It's just they're inseparable. And it's insidious, and it's if I would encourage everyone who's watching this to do some research about the policing in your area. Because I think for a lot of Minnesotans, the culture here is just very passive and don't cause a stir, don't ruffle any feathers, but these issues are affecting a huge portion of our nation. And one way that this sort of confronted me a few Father's Days ago, a few Junes ago, I was worshiping at a predominantly African-American Presbyterian church in North Minneapolis. And they were celebrating Father's Day. And I had always been taught you don't celebrate Mother's Day and Father's Day in churches because it like makes some people feel bad who, can be not helpful for folks who have had infertility and things like this. But they celebrated it so big in this church. And I was wondering why, that they were, just lifting up these fathers and these father figures in their congregation. And I learned later it's because to have a father and a father figure around is a really not unusual, but unusual enough that they wouldn't be incarcerated, that they would actually be a part of their children's lives growing up. And that kind of confrontation with your sense of what is real in the world and your own white existence, it just, you can't divorce policing from racial issues.
Well, I also think Jess has a point as well that we ought to pay attention to. And that's it. We can't divorce policing from conversations about racial injustice, but it can't be the only conversation either.
True.
Yeah.
What other conversations do we need to be having?
Well, I think the church, especially, like from our position I'll just speak for me, not you all, but yeah, I think I'm wary of us, the church losing like its unique testimony and its unique voice, the way we talk about things, like losing it to too much jargon or language that we have adopted or co-opted from like academic conversations or the political square. So I think I am conscious of I'm conscious of that.
Right. I mean, it goes to what Jesus was talking about. You cannot serve two masters, right? So what is driving the discourse, the language, the things that we are talking about? I mean, at this point, in this day and age, it is actually impossible not to have politics invade our pulpit. If we want to say anything, and I'm not talking about endorsing candidates, I'm talking about issues that have political implication. I mean, what you're talking about, Sarah, just educating ourselves on the systems that exist, and the ways we change those systems are through political means, right? But so how it's all so intertwined that it is really hard to, I think that is why it's hard to talk, why we have to, like you said, Amos, when you found out, you're like, okay, how do I talk about this in such a way that we don't lose people from the first sentence based upon, whatever.
Right. Yeah, I think if politics is like the study of the distribution of power, like if that's what we're talking about, then I would suggest that God is political, and that it's impossible for us to talk about God without talking about power. But I think we've got I think part of our task is part of my task as a preacher is to, and a pastor, not just a preacher, but as a pastor as well, is to find, is to reinterpret, and whatever the word we like to use is like exegete our context, right? To do some work on behalf of the people that are showing up to receive a proclamation and to hear what God has to say to us today, right? What does God have to say? I think for us, it's doing, I'm challenged to look at the text and say, well, what language do we already have? What stories and traditions, rituals, rites of passage, ways of being do we already have that can help us walk through this particular moment? And so sometimes that's reinterpreting, right? Some of the words that we have gotten accustomed to using that didn't originate in our rituals or traditions or our ways of like talking to each other in the church. And what I'm trying to say here is that we've actually got to give people an entry, like a way to enter into what we're doing right here. We can't make it more difficult for people to engage in these conversations.
As the perpetual, I always have a next question. I mean, so then my question in that is, then how do we make it easier? I mean, that's the thing, Sarah, you said something really important is, if you say something that alienates people, the reality is not saying it alienates a whole group of other people. At least in the Presbyterian church and a predominantly white tradition, the not saying has definitely alienated large populations of people. And maybe that, talk about a chicken and an egg question, maybe that speaks to why the denomination is so homogeneous, right? And what spaces are safe.
He's raising his hand.
Yeah.
Well, I want to just clarify. Like, I don't think we need to continue to say things like systemic racism, and use words like privilege. But we also, in the church, I think, need to learn how to give children's sermons to adults as well.
So then, what's the other word?
Well, we can't lose words like compassion and empathy and love. And I know they're weighted, right, with all kinds of considerations. And when we say things like, well, we ought to love one another, I know it sounds shallow to us right now in this moment, but we cannot stop saying that.
I did young adult ministry at Westminster previously, and it was my favorite thing to do. And Charlene and I have bonded over young adults from your work at Fifth Ave. And one of the things I felt like I could say to my young adults was, I love you, and this is the expectation I'm holding you to. Like, I love you so much, and I'm so proud of you for even showing up to church. And you're not just going to come here and have me organize a party for you. Like, we are going to dig into the gospel together and find out what it means, even if it totally unravels your high school youth group experience of what church is. And I do think that part of it is education. I mean, a lot of our folks are coming to us, I think, with like high school youth group level faith formation. I think you're right. There needs to be an entree into these conversations. And I do think you're right, Amos. The entree is, I love you even when I'm correcting you. I love you even when I am going to say things that are contradictory to the way that you live your life, right? Like the gospel talks a lot about money, and a lot of us have a decent amount of money. So what does that mean, right? Yeah.
So we've been using the metaphor of the table a lot at First Pres Berkeley, and just how I think the table is a revolutionary concept. Like you're saying, Amos, love and compassion. We've grown so accustomed to those words that we've forgotten actually just how crazy they are. And so I think a table is a very revolutionary concept versus a pulpit and pews. That is the model we've become quite comfortable with. Someone with X number of degrees gets to stand up in the front and tell us how to think or what to believe and blah, blah, blah. And we have generations like you're talking about, Sarah, young adults who are saying, like I'm actually gonna reject the premise like outright and say that the model needs to be flipped. And so one of the things that was mentioned today by a member is that the two things that are the two big questions or the two big expectations for us as the church is to show up and how to show up. So not just to show up just as we are with our thoughts, fully formed thoughts and opinions, but that we show up and, like you said, Sarah, show up and be prepared to actually like have someone say, look, well, let me correct you a little bit here and educate you or inform you or expand your understanding of what the world is actually like. How we show up is a huge thing. So to answer Hugh's question, he says, since y'all are speaking about races, why do you think racism takes place? I mean, what is the root cause of all racism and racially motivated hate, according to you? And I think it goes back to Genesis and why the crimes in Eden. There was always this notion that there wasn't enough, that someone was holding out, God was holding out, or that there wasn't enough blessing, there wasn't enough favor, there wasn't enough stuff. In the biggest sense, like what you were saying, Amos, there isn't enough power to go around. So we need to keep it localized here, which means we need to keep it from. And so one of the most interesting things I've heard actually in and around how the church should be moving forward is, do we actually know how to share power? Because we can have this conversation all the live long day about how racism is bad and we know this and we should value all lives equally. But in the actual church, are we okay with sometimes giving up power and sometimes just sharing it? And that means for some people feeling displaced, for some people whose opinions have always been asked of in the past few decades, all of a sudden we're asking different voices their opinions. And so I think racism is rooted in this notion of scarcity, when the gospel talks about abundance. And that's the unique language and narrative of our faith in all of this. Do you all want to add to anything about the root of racism?
That was beautiful, Charlene, by the way. Thank you. That was my way of saying, no, I don't want to add anything to that. But Sarah might want to add something.
Well, you know what I always think about that story in the Garden of Eden is that I believe this is true, that God never actually leaves. Never says that God leaves. And leaves them alone.
Right.
And so I think, I agree with everything you said. We have a perception of scarcity, but forget that God is accompanying us through this.
Yes.
But I think that that idea of truly sharing power, I've thought about that a lot. And to be honest, I know that I'm still in a position of power, but I'm at a much smaller church than I was previously. It's still a church that has power. I'm not going to, we have assets, we have resources. But, I think, and I don't want this to come out the wrong way, but what would it look like for people in power in our denomination to disengage from something knowingly, to allow other people to step in?
Yeah. Active handing of power, not having it wrested away in struggle. I mean, that's what we're seeing right now. It's struggle because power is not being given up. And in the midst of this, and something you've named, Sarah, is hope. So you were talking about how this past week at George Floyd Square, there was a joint rally, right, between Black and Asian communities.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Just that it was.
Yeah, sure. And I want to say too that just going back to the previous question, the actively handing over power, that I took the call that I'm in now with a sense of like totally being led by the Spirit. And I'm not sure I've like, it would just be interesting for leaders in our denomination to truly be able to give testimony about when in their careers, their lives of ministry, they've done things because they've genuinely felt led by the Spirit, and when they've done things to obtain more power and prestige. I would love to have an authentic, vulnerable conversation like that.
Woof.
At some point. But because you could frame it in, a real sense of call, right?
Yeah.
I don't think there's any, we all do things we don't feel called to, right? Anyways, yes, there was, thanks for shifting gears. There was a beautiful joint rally between the Asian American and Pacific Islander community in the Twin Cities and the organizers, or I think it was probably several organizations, Black Lives Matter, and different groups in the city that came together to, and I should say too that in Minnesota we have deep work to do around our history with Indigenous people in our state. So I currently sit on Dakota land, and so the presence at George Floyd Square has been Indigenous people and Asian Americans have been working together in this effort. So
yeah, when I heard that, I was very excited about that, which leads to my final question for all of us, and that's, where are you seeing, experiencing, witnessing hope? Maybe it's a voice, maybe it's a book, maybe it's an image. For me, it's that rally, that the coming together of communities that have been historically pitted against each other. And that speaks to Hugh's question of, in a scarcity model, you basically say, okay, 25% of the pie is left for all of these communities of color. Now you guys fight over it. And so it's no wonder that Black and Asian communities have often been at odds with one another, because that was the narrative that was kind of instilled into our DNA. And more and more we are seeing Black and Asian communities saying, no more. We, again, reject the premise, and we want to partner with and for one another, stand with and for one another in this time. So that's where I am gleaning hope in this moment. Amos?
Mine is very simple. It's out of this conversation that we just had. Yeah. So grateful, Sarah, for your company and for your willingness to say yes and step in to tell us where you've been, where you've gone, what's happened, who you're becoming.
Amen.
I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Sarah, where are you getting hope? Who? Voices, writers, people, experiences?
One person I'm finding a lot of hope from is someone in the Twin Cities who, but she's been on all the news outlets. She was interviewed by Oprah recently. Her name is Nikema Levy Armstrong, and she's an ordained minister and also a civil rights attorney. And what gives me hope from Nikema is that she is a voice in the Twin Cities who she can communicate about what's really going on to the wider world and tell the story in a way that's faithful and true. And I think, I've been looking for voices like that, people who are good communicators. And I think just back to what you were saying about Asian Americans and African Americans in our nation, like there are so many Asian Americans in our denomination who are in this work too, along with you, Charlene, who I've been trying to listen to and pay attention to, who are trying to resist the assumed relationship between racial existence. And so that gives me hope. And then also just people who keep showing up to church, man, in a pandemic, who are still leading and coming to church. People's faithfulness is really breathtaking sometimes. So.
Amen.
Sarah, thank you. Charlene, see you next time when we do this again. Thank you to everybody for joining us tonight, and encourage you all to go find something crucial to do or pray about. Good night.
Thank you.